Hi, Abel here. So, we have been told the same story for generations that men were hardwired by evolution to be the soul hunters, providers, and protectors, while women were strictly built for domestic life and gathering. We are told these rigid roles are written into our DNA. Because of this story is repeated so often in modern culture and social media, millions of people assume that masculinity and femininity and the rigid behaviors attached to them, like the meaningless traits, expectations, and behaviors we attach to this masculinity and femininity thing, are biological facts rather than socially constructed. But what if standard history assumptions and internet gurus got it completely wrong? Today, we are looking at peer-reviewed archaeological digs, genetic analysis, and psychological meta-analysis to uncover the truth. How human survival actually relied on fluid shared capability, and how rigid gender roles were invented by economic shifts, not our biology. So, does this mean men and women were biologically identical? Not quite. Men and women have natural biological baselines, but pre-agricultural women were upper body powerhouses, possessing bone density exceeding modern athletes. The extreme physical and economic gaps that emerged later were not purely genetic. They were created when settled agricultural societies imposed economic shifts, restricted diets, and confined social roles. Biology set a subtle baseline, but culture and economics created the wide divide. So, to understand whether our psychological traits are hardwired by biology or shaped by culture, we have to look at what large-scale psychological data actually reveals about human mind. So, the first study was done by main author Heidi and Archaeological in 2005, titled The Gender Similarities Hypothesis. So, in her landmark 2005 meta-analysis published in the American psychologist Dr. Janet Shibley Heidi synthesized data from 46 major meta-analyses evaluating psychological gender differences across cognitive abilities, communication styles, social behavior, and personality traits. Heidi discovered that 78% of all measured psychological gender differences were either close to zero or small, D/LE 0.35, as you can see here. I will explain it to you. This is the researcher's measurement technique. It's called Cohen's d effect. So 78% of all measured psychological gender differences were either close to zero or small, directly challenging the popular difference model that claims men and women possess radically different minds. So, furthermore, the paper showed that many differences fluctuate significantly based on age and social context, demonstrating that when gender norms and expectations are removed in experimental settings, key behavioral gaps shrink or disappears entirely. Ultimately, Heidi's findings prove that men and women are far more psychologically alike than distinct, and that rigid gender roles reflect social context far more than fixed biological limits. So, in this study, they carried out 46 meta-analyses. What it means? Heidi pulled together 46 separate meta-analyses evaluating millions of men and women across virtually every psychological area: how we think, cognition; how we speak, communication; how we lead, leadership; how we feel about our self-esteem; and how we act socially, aggression, empathy, personality. So when it says 78% on this study, what it means? In statics, researchers use a metric called Cohen's d effect size to measure how big the gap is between two groups. So as you can see here, I hope you see it. As you can see here, if it is d less than or equal to 0.10, it means it is close to 0. That means the difference is so tiny, it's practically invisible. It's practically invisible. If it is 0.11 less than d less than or equal to 0.35, it means it is small. So if it is 0.11 less than d less than or equal to 0.35, it means it is small. So that means a slight tilt, but both groups heavily overlap. If it is 0.36 less than d less than or equal to 0.65, it means it's moderate, a noticeable difference. That means a noticeable difference. If it is d greater than 0.65, it means large, a major difference between two groups. So Heidi discovered that 78% of all measured psychological traits fell into the close to zero or small categories. 30% from 78%, 30% were close to zero. That means men and women performed or scored almost identically. 48% were small. That means there was a tiny statistical difference, but the overlap between men and women was vast, like two bell curves sitting almost directly on top of each other. So context effects, the power of social norm, what it means. Heidi highlighted specific experiments like Lightdale and Prentice 1994. This is another study. She highlighted this study. This study tested what happens when you remove social pressure. So in a standard video game experiments where participants knew they were being watched, men dropped significantly more bombs, that means aggression, than women. But when researchers created anonymity, participants wore no names. They wore no names. Tags were placed on isolated rooms and were told gender didn't matter. They were told gender didn't matter. The gender gap completely disappeared, and women actually dropped slightly more bombs than men. You should underline this. So why this matters? This is a smoking gun for proving that traits are social constructs. If behavioral differences like aggression or competitiveness vanishes simply because people think no one is watching them, then the behavior isn't biological. It is performed to satisfy social expectations. So when scientists looked at decades of data on millions of people, they found that men and women overlap on 78% of all psychological traits. And when you strip away social pressure and surveillance, supposed masculine and feminine femininity behavioral differences, supposed masculine and feminine behavioral differences disappear entirely. So the second study was done by Sandra Bem and Archaeological 1981, titled Gender Schema. So in her 1981 paper published in Psychological Review, psychologist Sandra Bem introduced gender schema theory to explain how children acquire gender-type traits. Bem argued that gender roles are not biologically pre-programmed. Rather, children naturally extract information from their social environment and construct a gender schema, a cognitive network of association that categorizes traits, behaviors, and roles into masculine and feminine. Once formed, this internal schema acts as a mental lens, actively filtering how individuals perceive information. evaluate their own self-worth, and regulate their behavior to align with cultural expectations. Ultimately, the study demonstrated that sex-typed behavior is the result of cognitive learning through cultural immersion rather than fixed biological destiny. So, key takeaways and data points. What is a gender schema? A. It is a mental organization tool. So, from an early age, children observe the world and build cognitive structure, schemas, to make sense of incoming information. Cultural transmission. There is also cultural transmission. So, the schema itself is provided by society. Society teaches children which attributes, example, emotions, occupations, hobbies, belong to men versus women. So, when we go to B, how it shapes behavior and perceptions. There is a perceptual lens. So, once a schema is formed, it automatically influences attention, motivation, person's perception, and memory encoding. So, people remember schema consistent information better than non-consistent information. There is also self-concept alignment. Children learn to evaluate their own adequacy and preferences against their learned schema, choosing to adopt behaviors that their culture deems appropriate for their sex. Third field study was done by author Margaret Mead, titled Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies, 1935. Setting up the study, if gender traits were fixed biological inevitabilities, we would expect every human culture to define masculinity and femininity in the exact same way. But when anthropologists look across different human societies, that assumption breaks down completely. On this field study, in her classic 1935 ethnographic study, Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies, anthropologist Margaret Mead examined gender expectations across three distinct communities in Papua New Guinea, the Arapish, the Mundugumur, and the Chamboli. Mead observed that emotional temperament and behavioral norms varied drastically across these cultures, regardless of biological sex. Underline this. Among the Arapish, both men and women were socialized to be cooperative, gentle, and nurturing. Among the Mundugumur, both sexes were expected to be assertive, aggressive, and fierce. Meanwhile, among the Tichambuli, gender roles reversed Western expectation of the time, with women occupying dominant managerial roles, while men were socialized to be emotionally dependent and decoratively inclined. Ultimately, Mead argued that because traits like passivity, aggressiveness, or dominance can be assigned to either sex, depending on the society, these behavioral patterns reflect cultural conditioning rather than inherently sex-linked biological destiny. So, key data points: the three culture comparison. Mountain Arapish. There is Mountain Arapish. On these societies, both men and women displayed temperaments traditionally coded in the West as feminine, like nurturing, non-aggressive, and corporate. There is also River Mundugumur, or nicknamed Biwat. Both men and women displayed temperaments traditionally coded as masculine on these societies, like aggressiveness, competitiveness, highly independent. There is also Lake Tichambuli. Gender roles were inverted relative to 1930s Western norms. Women managed practical economic affairs and held dominant positions while men focused on artistic pursuits and social delicacy. So there is malleability of roles. Malleability of roles demonstrates that temperamental traits like aggressiveness, responsiveness, or dominance are not inherently sex-linked, but largely shaped by cultural expectations. For the study was done by Connell and Messerschmidt 2005, titled Hegemonic Masculinity, Rethinking the Concept. Very important study. Setting up the study, masculinity is not a static biological trait, nor it is a single universal standard. Instead, social structures organize different forms of masculinity into dynamic hierarchies of power and privilege. So, in their influential 2005 paper, Hegemonic Masculinity, Rethinking the Concept, sociologists Connell and Messerschmidt re-examine and reformulate the concept of hegemonic masculinity to account for social complexity, rather than treating masculinity as a rigid set of psychological traits or a simple fixed typology. The authors conceptualize it as a dynamic social pattern embedded in power relations and cultural hierarchy. They emphasize that multiple masculinities exist across local, regional, and global scales, and that dominant cultural standards are constantly contested and reshaped by social struggles, historical changes, and interactions with subordinate groups. Ultimately, Connell and Messerschmidt argue that gender practices are not biologically inevitable social reproductions underline this, but historically open structures that contain internal contradictions and possibilities for movement towards gender democracy. So key data points, there is multiple masculinities under this study. So multiple masculinities rejects the idea of a single universal male identity. Masculinity exists in plural forms, shaped by class, geography, and culture. There is also hierarchy and hegemony. Under this, dominant patterns of masculinity maintain power not through simple biological necessity, but through cultural leadership, social authority, and institutional privilege. There is agency and contestation. There is also agency and contestation. So, under this, subordinate masculinities and the agency of women actively influence, contest, and transform dominant ideals over time. There is also historical openness. Under this, gender hierarchies are dynamic arena of tension. They mutate across history and can be restructured towards greater equality, what the authors call gender democracy.